In the summer of 1087, within the stone walls of a monastery in Rouen, a stench so unbearable filled the corridors that even the most devoted servants fled in horror. The source of this nauseating odor was not a forgotten corpse or a plague pit, but the living body of one of medieval Europe's most powerful men. William the Conqueror, the Duke who had crossed the Channel and seized the English throne through blood and iron, was rotting alive. The man who had commanded armies, crushed rebellions, and reshaped an entire kingdom was now helpless, his massive body consuming itself from within while he still drew breath. What followed would become one of the most grotesque deaths in royal history, a demise so horrifying that chroniclers would document every putrid detail for generations to come. William's journey to this nightmarish end began not in battle, but through a tragic accident during a military campaign. In July 1087, at the age of 59, the aging but still formidable king had laid siege to the French town of Mantes. The campaign was born from fury and vengeance. King Philip I of France had mocked William's increasing girth, comparing the corpulent conqueror to a pregnant woman. The insult cut deep into William's pride, and he vowed to repay Philip's mockery with fire and sword. Mantes would burn as a response to the French king's jest, and William would prove that his power remained undiminished despite his advancing years. The siege proceeded with the brutal efficiency that had characterized William's entire military career. His forces surrounded Mantes, and as was customary in medieval warfare, he ordered the town put to the torch. Buildings erupted in flames, the screams of inhabitants filled the air, and smoke billowed into the summer sky. William rode through the burning streets on his warhorse, surveying the destruction he had wrought. For a man who had spent his life conquering and subduing, this was another triumph in a lifetime of victories. But fate, it seemed, had grown weary of William's conquests. As the king guided his horse through the smoldering ruins, his mount suddenly reared. The exact cause remains disputed by chroniclers. Some claimed the horse stepped on burning embers that had fallen from a collapsing building. Others suggested the animal was startled by a sudden collapse nearby. Whatever the trigger, the powerful destrier lurched forward violently, and William's massive body was thrown hard against the iron pommel of his saddle. The impact was devastating. The metal horn drove deep into his swollen abdomen, and the king felt something tear inside him. The pain was immediate and excruciating. William slumped in his saddle, gasping, his hands clutching his belly. His attendants rushed to his side as he nearly fell from his horse. The king was quickly helped down and examined by his physicians, but the internal damage was beyond their understanding. In an age before modern medicine, internal injuries were death sentences. The doctors could see no external wound, no blood, but William knew something terrible had happened inside his body. He could feel it, a deep wrongness spreading through his abdomen. Despite his agony, William refused to show weakness before his men. He ordered that he be taken to his capital at Rouen, to the priory of Saint-Gervais, where he might rest and recover. The journey back was torturous. Every movement of the litter that carried him sent waves of agony through his body. By the time they reached Rouen, the king was feverish and delirious. His physicians attempted every treatment known to medieval medicine. They bled him, applied poultices, administered herbal remedies, and prayed fervently for divine intervention. Nothing helped. In fact, William was deteriorating rapidly. Within days of the accident, the true horror of William's condition became apparent. His abdomen began to swell grotesquely, distending like an inflated bladder. The internal injury had ruptured organs and intestines, and infection was spreading through his body cavity. What we now know as peritonitis and gangrene had set in, and William's massive body was becoming a breeding ground for bacteria. The flesh of his stomach stretched tight and began to discolor, turning from red to purple to black in patches. But the worst symptom was the smell. The odor that emanated from the dying king was unlike anything his attendants had experienced. It was the smell of rot, of necrotic tissue decomposing while the host still lived. The stench filled William's chamber, seeped into the corridors, and pervaded the entire wing of the monastery. It was the smell of death, but death that had arrived too early, claiming its victim piece by piece. Servants assigned to care for the king began to gag and retch when they entered his room. They would hold cloths soaked in vinegar and herbs to their faces, but nothing could mask the overpowering reek of putrefaction. As the days passed, William's suffering intensified. The infection spread through his body, causing his flesh to literally rot while he remained conscious. His skin took on a greyish hue, and dark patches appeared where the tissue beneath was dying. The king's face, once ruddy and full, became gaunt and hollow, his eyes sunken deep into their sockets. He was in constant, unbearable pain. Medieval chroniclers, who were not prone to exaggeration about such matters, recorded that William's screams could be heard throughout the monastery. He begged for death, for release from the agony that consumed him. The psychological torment was perhaps worse than the physical suffering. William had spent his entire life as a warrior and conqueror. He had been born the illegitimate son of Robert, Duke of Normandy, and had fought from childhood to claim and hold his inheritance. His enemies had mocked him as William the Bastard, and he had answered their derision with violence and determination. At age 24, he had secured Normandy. At 38, he had invaded England, defeated King Harold at Hastings, and claimed the English throne. He had subdued rebellions, crushed his enemies, and built an empire through sheer force of will. Now, at the end of his life, that same will was powerless against the rot consuming his body. William could not fight this enemy with sword or strategy. He could not intimidate it with his reputation or overcome it with courage. The bacteria spreading through his organs cared nothing for his titles, his achievements, or his power. The conqueror, who had bent kingdoms to his will, was being conquered by his own decaying flesh. The irony was not lost on him. In his lucid moments, he reportedly wept, not from pain, but from the bitter understanding of his helplessness. As William's condition worsened, something even more terrible occurred. His most trusted servants, the men who had served him for years, began to abandon him. The smell was so overwhelming that even duty and loyalty could not overcome basic human revulsion. Attendants would enter his chamber to bring food or change his bedding, but they would flee within minutes, unable to bear the stench. Some claimed they would rather face punishment than endure another moment in that room. The king, who had commanded absolute loyalty, now found himself increasingly alone, but abandonment by his servants was only the beginning of William's betrayal. As news spread through the monastery and into the surrounding area that the king was dying, opportunists began to circle like vultures. William's chamber contained not just his person, but also his possessions, his treasures accumulated over a lifetime of conquest. Gold, silver, jewels, fine clothes, and precious artifacts filled chests and lined the walls. These treasures represented power, wealth, and status. And as William lay dying and defenseless, hands began reaching for them. First it was small items. A gold chain disappeared from a table. A jeweled dagger vanished from its sheath. Then, emboldened by the lack of consequences, the theft became more brazen. Servants, guards, and even some nobles who had come to pay their respects began pillaging the dying king's possessions. They would enter the chamber, covering their faces against the stench, grab whatever valuable they could carry, and flee. William was aware of what was happening. In his moments of consciousness, he could see figures moving through his room, taking his things, but he was too weak to call out or stop them. The chronicler Orderic Vitalis, who documented these events, wrote with horror about the scene. He described how men who had once knelt before William in reverence now stepped over his rotting body to reach his treasures. Some reportedly laughed as they divided their spoils, joking about the great conqueror's helplessness. It was a fall from grace so complete, so degrading, that it shocked even medieval observers accustomed to the brutalities of their age. The man who had terrorized England into submission, who had ordered the harrying of the north that killed tens of thousands, who had ruled through fear and strength, was now a victim of petty theft, unable even to defend his personal belongings. Throughout this ordeal, William sought spiritual comfort. Despite his brutal career, or perhaps because of it, he had always been a devout Christian. He had built churches and monasteries, granted lands to religious institutions, and sought the church's blessing for his conquest of England. Now, facing death, he desperately wanted absolution for his sins. Priests and monks attended him, hearing his confessions and administering last rites. But even these holy men struggled to remain in the chamber for long. They would rush through prayers, bless the king hastily, and retreat, gasping for fresh air. In his confessions, William acknowledged the violence of his reign. He admitted to the deaths of countless thousands, to the destruction of villages and towns, to the cruel suppression of rebellions. He particularly lamented the harrying of the North, a campaign of systematic destruction he had ordered in 1069 to crush English resistance. For months, Norman soldiers had burned crops, slaughtered livestock, destroyed farming tools, and killed anyone who resisted. The result was a famine that killed an estimated 100,000 people. It was ethnic cleansing on a massive scale, and even by the brutal standards of the 11th century, it was considered excessive. William also confessed to his treatment of his eldest son, Robert Curthose. Their relationship had been fraught for years, marked by rebellion and reconciliation. Robert had even fought against his father in battle, wounding him during a skirmish in 1079. Now, as William lay dying, he worried about the succession. He designated Robert to inherit Normandy, while his second son, William Rufus, would take England. His third son, Henry, would receive only money, a decision that would lead to years of fraternal conflict. But these plans, made in pain and delirium, would prove difficult to implement. As July turned to August, William's body continued its grotesque transformation. The swelling in his abdomen grew worse, his belly distending to an enormous size. The skin stretched so tight, it appeared translucent in places, and the discoloration deepened. The putrid smell intensified to the point where even approaching the building became difficult. Chroniclers recorded that people in the monastery's courtyard could smell the king's rotting body. Birds reportedly avoided flying over that section of the building. The very air seemed poisoned by the stench of his decay. On September 9th, 1087, William the Conqueror finally died. According to witnesses, his death came at dawn as the bells of Rouen cathedral rang for morning prayers. The sound of the bells apparently stirred the dying king to consciousness one final time. He attempted to raise his hands in prayer, mumbled something about commending his soul to Mary, the Mother of God, and then expired. After weeks of agony, after his body had been consumed by rot while he still lived, death came almost peacefully, but the horror was far from over. The moment William died, the last of his attendants fled. The few servants who had remained, perhaps out of duty or hope for reward, abandoned the chamber immediately. They left the king's body where it lay, surrounded by the possessions that hadn't yet been stolen. The corpse, already in an advanced state of decomposition due to the infection that had killed him, was left unattended in the late summer heat. For hours, possibly for most of the day, William's body lay alone in that stinking chamber while messengers were dispatched and arrangements were made. The problem facing those responsible for William's funeral was unprecedented. They had the body of a king, which demanded royal honors and ceremony, but that body was so decomposed and malodorous that no one wanted to approach it. Normal embalming procedures were impossible. The embalmers who were summoned took one look, or rather one smell, and refused the task. The body needed to be transported from Rouen to Caen, where William had requested burial at the Abbey of Saint-Étienne, which he had founded. But how could they move a corpse in such a state? Eventually, a local knight named Herluin agreed to organize the funeral in exchange for payment. It was a task no one else would accept. Herluin arranged for the body to be roughly prepared and placed in a lead-lined coffin to contain the smell. Even this process was nightmarish. Those who had to touch the body reported that the flesh was soft and yielding, that pieces came away in their hands. The corpse was wrapped in layers of cloth soaked in wine and spices in a desperate attempt to mask the odor, but nothing could truly contain the stench. The coffin was sealed as quickly as possible. The journey from Rouen to Caen was supposed to be a solemn funeral procession, a final tribute to the great conqueror. Instead, it became a race against decomposition. The coffin was loaded onto a wagon and covered with a pall, but the smell leaked out. As the procession moved through the Norman countryside, peasants and townspeople who had gathered to pay respects found themselves gagging and fleeing. Some chroniclers recorded that people threw flowers toward the procession, not as a sign of respect, But in a futile attempt to counter the odor, dogs that approached the funeral wagon would howl and run away, disturbed by the smell. When the procession reached Caen, there was a delay that would prove catastrophic. A fire had broken out in the town, possibly started accidentally, and the funeral party had to wait while it was extinguished. The coffin remained in the summer heat for additional hours. Inside the sealed lead container, the processes of decomposition accelerated. Gases built up within the bloated corpse. The pressure inside the coffin increased. By the time the funeral could proceed to the Abbey Church, the situation had become dangerous. The Church of Saint-Étienne in Caen was crowded with nobles, bishops and clergy who had gathered to honor the deceased king. Despite the rumors about the condition of the body, protocol and respect for the throne demanded their presence. The church was decorated with appropriate solemnity. Prayers were prepared. The stone sarcophagus that would hold William's body sat open and ready before the altar. Everything was arranged for a dignified royal funeral. But dignity was about to become impossible. The pallbearers carried the heavy lead coffin into the church and approached the sarcophagus. The first problem became immediately apparent. Despite the lead lining meant to contain it, a terrible smell was emanating from the coffin. As it was carried down the aisle, members of the congregation began to cough and cover their faces. Some of the assembled nobles and clergy backed away, but the ceremony had to continue. The coffin was placed beside the sarcophagus, and priests began the funeral rites. Then came the moment when William's body needed to be transferred from the coffin to the sarcophagus for final burial. The pallbearers opened the lead coffin, and the smell that had been partially contained was suddenly released in full force into the enclosed space of the church. The reaction was immediate and violent. People throughout the congregation began to retch. Some vomited, others fled toward the doors. But the pallbearers, committed to completing their task, attempted to lift the body. This is when the ultimate horror occurred. William's body, swollen with the gases of decomposition, wrapped in cloths and armor, had to be maneuvered into a stone sarcophagus. But there was a problem. The sarcophagus had been prepared years earlier, when William was a younger, fitter man. In his later years, the king had become enormously fat, his girth legendary. The bloating caused by decomposition had made his body even larger. When the pallbearers tried to force the corpse into the stone coffin, it wouldn't fit. They pushed harder, trying to compress the body into the space. The swollen abdomen pressed against the sides of the sarcophagus. More pressure was applied, and then, to the horror of everyone present, William's body burst. The abdomen ruptured, possibly where it had been injured at Mantes, and the contents of the decomposed corpse erupted outward. The smell that had been bad before became absolutely unbearable. It was, chroniclers wrote, like the gates of hell had opened. Orderic Vitalis, describing the scene later, wrote that the stench was so powerful it was almost visible, like a dark cloud filling the church. Nobles and bishops fled in panic, pushing past each other to reach the doors. Many were openly vomiting. Priests abandoned the ceremony mid-prayer, running from the altar. The carefully planned royal funeral descended into chaos. Even the most duty-bound attendants could not remain in the building. Within minutes, the church was nearly empty, with only a handful of clergy remaining at a distance, covering their faces with their vestments. The few who remained attempted to salvage the situation. Incense was brought in, massive amounts of it, and set burning throughout the church. Perfumes were sprinkled. The body was hastily shoved into the sarcophagus, though it still did not fit properly. It was decided to seal the tomb immediately rather than attempt any further ceremony. Stone masons were called to seal the sarcophagus with mortar and slabs. Even these workers, accustomed to handling the dead, had to work in shifts, retreating regularly to breathe fresh air before returning to their task. The funeral, such as it was concluded in unseemly haste. Prayers were mumbled rapidly by priests standing as far from the tomb as possible. No eulogies were delivered, no elaborate ceremony celebrated William's achievements. The man who had conquered England, who had ruled 2 kingdoms, who had been one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe, was buried in chaos and disgrace. His funeral remembered not for honoring his legacy, but for the revolting spectacle of his bursting corpse. News of the horrific funeral spread rapidly throughout Norman and English territories. The story was too grotesque, too shocking not to share. Within weeks, everyone from nobles to peasants had heard how the great conqueror's body had exploded in church, how the assembled nobles had fled vomiting, how the burial had been conducted in panicked haste. For a society that placed enormous importance on proper funeral rites and the dignity of the dead, William's end was seen as particularly shameful. But more than mere gossip, the story took on symbolic significance. Medieval people believed strongly in signs and divine judgment. Many interpreted William's gruesome death and burial as God's verdict on his life. He had lived by violence, conquering and subduing through brutality. He had ordered the deaths of thousands, destroyed communities, and ruled through fear. Now, in death, he had been denied even basic dignity. His body had betrayed him, falling apart before witnesses, unable even to remain intact for burial. The symbolism was especially potent because of the contrast between William's power in life and his helplessness in death. He had commanded armies, but his own body defeated him. He had accumulated vast wealth, but it was stolen as he died. He had inspired fear in thousands, but in the end he inspired only revulsion. The man who had everything was reduced to nothing. It was a morality tale that resonated deeply with medieval sensibilities about the temporary nature of worldly power and the inevitability of death. Religious commentators seized on William's end as a lesson about pride and sin. Sermons were preached, using the story as an example of how even the mightiest must humble themselves before God. The harrying of the North was specifically mentioned as a sin so great that even William's pious donations could not atone for it. His violent suppression of English resistance, his ruthless treatment of rebels, his iron rule, all were cited as reasons why God had allowed such a degrading death. Whether or not this interpretation was fair, it stuck. William's rotting death became part of his legend as much as his victories. The practical aftermath was also significant. The unseemly nature of William's burial created problems for his successors. His second son, William Rufus, who inherited England, was reportedly disgusted by the accounts of his father's funeral and wanted nothing to do with Normandy, which went to his brother Robert. The division of William's realm, already problematic, was made worse by the shameful circumstances of his death. It seemed to symbolize the fragmentation that would follow as his sons fought each other for dominance. The tomb itself became a site of mixed significance. Saint-Étienne Abbey in Caen housed the grave, and pilgrims did come to visit, but the site never achieved the veneration typical of royal tombs. There was something too unsettling about William's burial for it to become a proper shrine. The story of the bursting corpse was too well known, too horrifying. Instead of inspiring devotion, the tomb inspired unease. Over the centuries, William's tomb suffered various indignities that seemed to echo his burial. In 1522, during renovations at the abbey, the tomb was opened and disturbed. Chroniclers of that period reported finding only scattered bones, as if the body had never been properly interred. In 1562, during the French Wars of Religion, Calvinist forces ransacked the abbey and completely destroyed William's tomb. The bones were scattered, lost, or destroyed. Only a single thigh bone was reportedly saved by a local monk. When the abbey was restored, a new monument was erected in the 19th century, but it contained only that single bone placed in a new coffin. Thus, the conqueror's final resting place is, ironically, almost empty. The man who claimed so much territory, who planted his banner over England and held it through force of arms, has less than a complete skeleton to mark his grave. His physical legacy is as fragmented as his rotted body. The medical reality of William's death is now better understood than it was in the 11th century. The injury from the saddle pommel almost certainly ruptured internal organs, probably his intestines and possibly his spleen or liver. This would have caused internal bleeding initially, but more seriously, it would have released intestinal bacteria into his abdominal cavity. Peritonitis, an infection of the abdominal lining, would have developed rapidly in an age without antibiotics. The infection would have caused the characteristic swelling as fluids accumulated and tissues became inflamed. The gangrene that chroniclers described would have been both gas gangrene, caused by bacteria producing gases within the tissues, and wet gangrene, where tissue dies and decays due to infection and poor blood flow. The combination would have been agonizing and unstoppable. The smell would have been produced by the bacterial breakdown of tissue, releasing compounds like putrescine and cadaverine, which are responsible for the smell of decay. William's size worked against him in multiple ways. His obesity, which had been increasing in his later years, meant more tissue to become infected. It also meant worse circulation, allowing gangrene to spread more easily. The large amount of abdominal fat would have provided an excellent environment for bacterial growth. When he died, the gases produced by bacterial action inside his corpse would have built up pressure, especially in the heat of late summer. The rupturing of his abdomen during the funeral was almost inevitable given these conditions. Modern medicine would have saved William, likely with relative ease. Antibiotics would have stopped the infection. Surgery could have repaired any internal injuries and cleaned out infected tissue. Even the immediate aftermath of the injury, if treated quickly in a hospital, would likely have been survivable. But in 1087, internal injuries were death sentences. The most skilled physicians of the age could do nothing but watch William die, unable even to ease his pain significantly. The psychological impact of such a death cannot be overstated. To rot while still alive, to feel one's own body decomposing, to smell the stench of your own decay, is a horror beyond imagination. For a man like William, whose life had been defined by physical prowess, control, and domination, the experience must have been psychologically devastating. He was forced to confront not just his mortality, but his helplessness, his body becoming his enemy in a way no external foe had ever been. There is something universally terrifying about the idea of one's body betraying one from within. We can fight external enemies, but when our own flesh becomes the problem, there is nowhere to turn. William's death tapped into a primal fear that resonates across centuries. It is why the story has endured, retold by chroniclers, historians, and now reaching modern audiences. The grotesque details, far from being mere sensationalism, speak to something fundamental about human vulnerability. The story also serves as a stark reminder of the limits of power. William the Conqueror is remembered as one of history's most successful military commanders. He achieved what many thought impossible, invading England and making himself its king. He held that throne through political acumen and ruthless force. He reshaped English society, introducing Norman feudalism, conducting the Domesday Survey, building castles throughout the land. His impact on England was profound and lasting. The English language itself was permanently altered by the Norman conquest. Yet all that power, all those achievements, could not save William from a banal accident and the simple reality of bacterial infection. The armies he commanded could not fight microorganisms. The castles he built provided no defense against peritonitis. The fear he inspired in his subjects was meaningless to the gangrene consuming his flesh. In the end, the conqueror was conquered by the smallest of enemies, bacteria he could not even see. This contrast between worldly power and biological vulnerability has made William's death a cautionary tale. Medieval people saw it as divine judgment. Modern audiences might see it as a reminder of human fragility. Either interpretation recognizes the same truth. No amount of success, power, or achievement can ultimately protect us from our physical nature. We are, regardless of our accomplishments, biological organisms subject to disease, decay, and death. The horror of William's end is also compounded by the abandonment he suffered. In his time of greatest need, when he was most vulnerable, those he had ruled abandoned him. His servants fled the stench, his possessions were stolen, his funeral became a disaster. There was a failure of basic human dignity, both in how he died and how he was buried. This adds a layer of tragedy to the horror. William died not just in pain, but alone, betrayed, and ultimately dishonored. The theft of his possessions while he lay dying is particularly poignant. These were not just valuable objects, but symbols of his life's work. Every piece of gold, every jewel, every fine cloth represented a conquest, a victory, a moment of his remarkable career. To have them stolen as he lay helpless must have been emotionally devastating, a concrete demonstration that his power was already gone, that he was already irrelevant. The vultures were already picking over his legacy before he had even died. The contrast with his funeral and burial compounds this indignity. Royal funerals were supposed to be magnificent affairs, celebrating the monarch's life and smoothing their transition to whatever lay beyond. They were political events, demonstrating continuity of power and the majesty of kingship. William's funeral achieved none of this. Instead of celebrating his legacy, it became a story of horror and chaos. Instead of demonstrating the dignity of the crown, it showed a corpse bursting before a fleeing congregation. In analyzing William's death, we must also consider what it meant for those who witnessed it. The nobles, clergy, and servants who saw the king rot and die were traumatized by the experience. Many had known William for years, had served in his armies, had benefited from his reign. To see such a powerful figure reduced to a rotting, stinking corpse was psychologically devastating. It would have shaken their understanding of power, authority, and their own mortality. The clergy present would have struggled with theological questions. Why would God allow such suffering? Was this punishment? And if so, was William's sin so great as to deserve this particular horror? Could his confessions and last rites save his soul despite his degraded death? These were not abstract questions, but immediate, pressing concerns as they watched their king decompose. The faith that should have provided comfort instead raised difficult questions. For the common people who heard the story, William's death served as a strange kind of justice. He had ruled England harshly. The harrying of the North alone had killed tens of thousands through starvation and exposure. Rebellions had been crushed with extreme violence. Heavy taxes had impoverished many. While William brought stability and administration, he did so through fear. To hear that such a fearsome king had died in agony, rotting alive, must have seemed like cosmic justice to those who had suffered under his rule. Yet even among those who had no love for William, there was likely some horror at his fate. Medieval society, for all its brutality, had strong ideas about proper treatment of the dead. Even an enemy should be buried with dignity. That William, a crowned king, had been treated so poorly in death would have disturbed people across the social spectrum. It suggested a breakdown of proper order, a failure of fundamental civilized behavior. The spreading of the story also served a social function. It became a teaching tale, used to instruct about pride, mortality, and the limits of worldly power. Parents told it to children, priests used it in sermons, nobles repeated it as a cautionary reminder to themselves. The grotesque details ensured it would be remembered, and the moral lessons meant it would be repeated. In an oral culture where stories carried important social and moral information, William's rotting death became a significant narrative. Chroniclers of the period, particularly Orderic Vitalis and William of Malmesbury, recorded the events in detail precisely because they recognized the story's significance. They were not merely being sensationalist, though they certainly did not spare the gruesome details. They were documenting what they saw as an important historical and moral event. Their detailed accounts have ensured that we, nearly 1,000 years later, can understand what happened with remarkable clarity. The story has continued to resonate through history. It has been retold in countless histories, referenced in literature, and serves as one of the most memorable deaths in royal history. It competes with the deaths of other monarchs for sheer horror, but few can match the combination of drawn-out suffering, degradation, and grotesque finale that characterized William's end. It has become inseparable from his legend, mentioned almost as often as his victories. Modern retellings of William's story almost always include his death, often in detail. Biographers struggle with how to present it, trying to balance historical accuracy with readability. Documentaries linger on the details, recognizing that audiences are both horrified and fascinated. The death has in some ways overshadowed other aspects of his life and reign. People who know little else about William the Conqueror often know he died rotting and that his body exploded at his funeral. This lasting fascination speaks to something fundamental about human psychology. We are drawn to horror, especially horror that befalls the powerful. There is something compelling about the mighty being brought low, especially in such a dramatic and disgusting fashion. It satisfies something in us, perhaps a desire for justice, perhaps simply a morbid curiosity. Whatever the reason, William's rotting death continues to captivate audiences centuries after the events. The medical details, understood through modern knowledge, add another layer of horror. Knowing what was happening inside William's body, understanding the bacterial processes that caused his suffering, makes the story even more disturbing. We can comprehend the slow tissue death, the spreading infection, the building gases, in ways medieval people could not. This knowledge makes it no less terrible, only more precisely terrible. In conclusion, the death of William the Conqueror stands as one of history's most horrifying and meaningful royal deaths. It was not a clean death in battle, which might have been celebrated as heroic. It was not a peaceful passing in old age, which would have been dignified. Instead, it was a slow, agonizing rot, watched by all, accompanied by abandonment and theft, and culminating in a grotesque burial that shocked witnesses. Every aspect of his death seemed designed to strip away the glory of his life. The man who had conquered England, who had defeated Harold at Hastings, who had subdued rebellions and built an empire, was in the end conquered by something invisible and inevitable. The flesh that had carried him through battles failed him. The body that had been his instrument of will became his prison and his torture. William the Conqueror, who had bent so much to his will, could not control his own decay. His death serves as a reminder that no matter how great our achievements, no matter how much power we accumulate, we cannot escape our fundamental biological nature. We are mortal, vulnerable, and subject to the same processes of disease and decay as anyone else. Thrones and crowns provide no immunity to peritonitis. Victories in battle mean nothing to gangrene. Power cannot prevent rot. The theft of his possessions, the abandonment by his servants, the chaotic funeral all underscore another truth. Worldly relationships are often transactional and temporary. Those who serve the powerful do so because of that power. When the power fades, so does the loyalty. William's wealth could not buy true devotion from people who would rather flee than endure the smell of his dying body. His authority meant nothing when he could no longer enforce it. Yet there is also something profoundly human in his story. The confessions, the attempts at reconciliation with his children, the seeking of spiritual comfort, show a man confronting his mortality and trying to find meaning and redemption. Beneath the crown and the reputation for brutality was a human being who feared death and hoped for salvation. His suffering, while extreme, was fundamentally human suffering. The horror of William's death is thus multi-layered. It is medical horror, the reality of rotting alive. It is social horror, the abandonment and theft. It is existential horror, the stripping away of dignity and power. And it is human horror, the confrontation with mortality and helplessness. All these layers combine to create a story that has resonated across centuries, horrifying and fascinating in equal measure. 938 years after that terrible summer in Rouen, we still tell the story of how William the Conqueror died. We still recoil at the details, still feel something of the shock that witnesses must have experienced. The story has survived because it touches on fundamental truths about power, mortality, and human nature. It reminds us that beneath all our achievements and status, we are fragile creatures of flesh and blood, subject to forces we cannot fully control. William the Conqueror reshaped England and changed the course of history. The Domesday Book, the castles, the Norman aristocracy, the changes to the English language, all these legacies endure. But alongside these monuments to his power stands the story of his death, a monument to his mortality. History remembers both the conqueror and the conquered, the powerful king and the helpless victim of his own rotting flesh. And perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps it is important that we remember not just what William achieved, but how he ended, rotting alive in a monastery, abandoned and betrayed, his body bursting at his funeral. This is the full measure of the man, both his triumphs and his degradation, both his power and his vulnerability. The reign of William the Conqueror transformed medieval Europe, but his death transformed our understanding of power and mortality. He conquered kingdoms, but was conquered by bacteria. He inspired fear, but ended by inspiring revulsion. He accumulated wealth, but died robbed. He commanded loyalty, but was abandoned. He sought dignity, but found degradation. In every way, his death was the opposite of his life, and that contrast is what makes his story so powerful and so disturbing. The conqueror, in the end, was conquered by the one enemy no one can defeat, death itself, made all the more terrible by arriving slowly, painfully, and publicly, reducing a king to a rotting corpse that could not even be buried without causing horror. This is the legacy of William's death, a legacy as enduring as any of his victories and far more disturbing.